You are poorer today than you were last year, and you were poorer last year than you were the year before. And nobody sat you down and told you, because they need you to keep showing up to work, keep paying your taxes, and keep believing that this is temporary. It is not temporary, it is a collapse, and you are inside of it right now. The money in your bank account buys less than it did 30 days ago. The retirement you were promised is not funded. The Social Security check your parents are counting on will be cut by 28% in less than 7 years. The bank where you keep your savings is sitting on losses it has not told you about. And your government, the one that takes 25% of every dollar you earn, just released a balance sheet showing it owes $8 for every $1 it has. Fortune magazine called it insolvent. The media did not cover it. And you found out from a YouTube video, 825 people were fired today. Not laid off from a factory. Fired from tech companies and replaced with artificial intelligence. Tomorrow it will be 825 more. And the CEO, who just cut half his entire workforce, said every company in America will do the same thing within 12 months. 150,000 families filed for bankruptcy in the last 90 days. Small business failures are up 91%. 30 million Americans are behind on their credit cards, and every single day they do not pay. $368 million more in interest gets added to what they already cannot afford. And the man whose job it is to advise the president on the economy went on national television and called your pain the last of their concerns. You know something is wrong. You have known for a while. You feel it when you open a bill. You feel it when you check your account on a Sunday night. You feel it in that pit in your stomach when you think about your kids and what kind of life they are going to be able to afford. That feeling is not anxiety. That feeling is accurate. That feeling is your brain processing everything that is breaking at the same time and arriving at a conclusion that your television will never confirm. So I am going to confirm it for you right now. You are living through the greatest collapse in American history, and by the time this video is over, you are going to know exactly why everything feels the way it feels, and you are never going to blame yourself for it again. The financial system underneath you is quietly cracking, and the people who are supposed to be watching it are hoping you do not notice. All right, I need to talk to you about something that is happening right now in the American banking system that almost nobody is covering and that should genuinely concern you because it is the kind of thing that looks completely fine on the surface until one morning it very suddenly is not fine at all. The FDIC just released its 2026 risk review, and buried inside that report is a number that should make your stomach drop. American banks are currently sitting on $306 billion in unrealized losses on their securities portfolios. Now let me explain what that means in plain English because this is important. When a bank buys a bond or a mortgage-backed security, it pays a certain price for it. If interest rates go up after the purchase, the market value of that security goes down. The bank has not sold it yet, so the loss is not realized. It is just sitting there on the books like a ticking time bomb waiting for a moment of stress to detonate. That is exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank in 2023. They had $17 billion in unrealized losses. Depositors got nervous, and the bank collapsed in 48 hours. The second and third largest bank failures in American history happened within days of each other that year. And right now, the banking system as a whole is carrying $306 billion in those same kinds of losses. And it gets worse. Florida Atlantic University published an update on their banking risk screener, and the numbers are alarming. Out of approximately 5,000 banks in the United States, 1,788 of them have total commercial real estate exposure greater than 300% of their total equity capital. That is up from 1,697 the previous quarter. Over 1,077 banks have exposure greater than 400%, 504 banks are above 500%, and 216 banks are above 600% of their equity in commercial real estate loans. That means over 1/3 of all banks in the country have what researchers are calling serious CRE exposure. And the New York Federal Reserve said it plainly. U.S. banks are extending their impaired commercial real estate mortgages to avoid writing off their capital, leading to credit misallocation and a buildup of financial fragility. They have a name for this strategy. It is called extend and pretend. The banks are pretending the loans are fine by extending the terms rather than acknowledging the losses, and the regulators are letting them do it because the alternative is acknowledging that the problem is too big to absorb. And right now, $900 billion in commercial real estate debt is set to mature between now and 2027, with office sector delinquency rates already exceeding 12%. That is the maturity wall. That is when the pretending stops. The FDIC has 60 banks on its confidential problem list right now, which is up from previous quarters, and 722 banks reported unrealized losses exceeding 50% of their total capital, according to data cited by financial analysts. And the Fed just injected $18.5 billion into the banking system through overnight repos, which are emergency short-term loans from the Federal Reserve to banks that need cash immediately. That was the fourth largest liquidity injection since COVID. And a research firm that specializes in banking safety published a warning 3 weeks ago saying that the Federal Reserve itself is sending an indirect message through its own published research. The message is that depositors have a responsibility to understand the condition of the banks holding their savings, because if a crisis occurs, the Fed may argue that the warning signs were already visible and that depositors ignored them. Read that again. The Fed is publishing research that could later be used to argue that you should have known. That is not reassurance. That is a disclaimer. And it is happening while the Iran war is driving oil above $110 a barrel. Energy costs are spiking across every industry, and the commercial real estate market is collapsing underneath the very banks that are pretending everything is fine. The economy is not slowing down. It is splitting in half, and you are probably on the wrong side. Here is something that is going to change how you understand every economic headline you read for the rest of this year. There is no longer one American economy. There are two, and they are moving in completely opposite directions at the same time. CBS News just published a piece last week with a headline that said it plainly. For many Americans, the recession is already here, and when you look at the data underneath the headline GDP number, you understand exactly what they mean. GDP grew in the first quarter. That sounds good. But when you break apart what is actually driving that growth, the picture falls apart. Consumer goods spending is essentially flat. Real spending across every income group has turned slightly negative in recent months. The consumer, who drives 70 cents of every dollar of GDP, is pulling back. So what is propping up the number? Two things. First, defense spending. Military expenditures crossed $1 trillion this year, roughly a 15% jump from the year before, driven by the Iran war. To put that in perspective, that is more than the next 14 countries on Earth spend on defense combined. And second, corporate capital investment in AI data centers. One narrow sector of the economy is booming while everything else is stagnating. Strip out the war spending and the AI build-out, and the American consumer economy is already contracting. And here is where it becomes a two-economy story. Bank of America's internal data shows that most of the spending growth that is still happening is being driven by higher-income households. The people at the top of the income distribution, the ones with investment portfolios that are still near record highs, they are spending. The people at the bottom are cutting back. Whirlpool just reported that appliance sales are down nearly 10%. When people stop replacing their dishwashers, that is not a confident economy. That is a household that has already cut dining out, already cut the gym, already cut the vacation, and is now cutting the things inside their own home. CBS called it a K-shaped economy, and that framing is exactly right. The top of the K is rising, the bottom is falling, and the GDP number is the average of the two, which means it looks fine on paper, while half the country is drowning. Meanwhile, CPI inflation jumped to 3.3% in March, the highest since May 2024, driven by a 19% year-over-year spike in gasoline and a 44% spike in heating oil. The OECD has revised U.S. inflation projections to 4.2% for the year, 1.2 percentage points higher than pre-war forecasts. The Federal Reserve is projecting similar numbers. The PCE price index, which is the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, could hit 4% by year-end according to the Cato Institute, which would be double the Fed's 2% target. And EY Parthenon's chief economist Gregory Dacko, who also serves as president of the National Association for Business Economics, projects the war could drag GDP down by 0.3 percentage points, slowing growth to 1.8% for the year. That is approaching the threshold where any additional shock, another oil spike, a banking stress event, a consumer confidence collapse, tips the entire thing into recession. And Moody's is now warning that the probability of a recession this year has climbed above 50%. Fortune magazine reported that Deutsche Bank and Oxford Economics both ran simulations showing that if Brent crude hits $140 a barrel for 8 weeks, the U.S. edges toward what they called a temporary standstill, with layoffs pushing up unemployment. And the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey, which measures how households feel about their own financial health, shows that the conflict in Iran erased every single point of improvement in consumer confidence since February. All of it, gone. In 3 weeks. So the next time you hear someone on television say the economy is strong because GDP is growing, I want you to ask one question. Strong for who? Because if you are in the bottom half of the K, if you are the person paying $3.88 for gas and watching your grocery bill climb and doing math on whether you can afford your mortgage this month, the economy is not strong. The economy is splitting apart. And the number on the screen is hiding the side you are standing on. 150,000 bankruptcy filings in 90 days. Small business bankruptcies, up 91%. And the Iran war's impact has not even hit the numbers yet. 565,759 bankruptcies were filed in the United States in 2025. That was an 11% increase over 2024. And the data coming in for 2026 says it is accelerating. Total bankruptcy filings in the first quarter of 2026 climbed 14% year over year, reaching 150,009 cases between January and March, according to data from Epic AACR published by the American Bankruptcy Institute. That is 150,000 families and businesses that walked into a courthouse and said, "I cannot pay my bills anymore," in 90 days. And the breakdown is where it gets truly alarming. Small business bankruptcies under Subchapter 5 surged 67% in Q1 2026, jumping from 499 filings a year ago to 833. Commercial Chapter 11 filings, which are larger corporate restructurings, climbed 37% from 1,764 to 2,422. In February alone, small business bankruptcies were 91% higher than the same month the year before. 91%. Chapter 11, large corporate restructurings were up 60% in February. Individual Chapter 7 filings, which is the kind where you liquidate everything because there is nothing left to reorganize, increased 17% to 89,259 cases. And Chapter 7 filings for consumers jumped nearly 15% in 2025, fueled by record credit card debt and the resumption of student loan collections. A bankruptcy law professor at Florida Atlantic University named Alexander Hernandez described what is happening as a financial reset and said 2026 could potentially be a record year across all bankruptcy chapters. And ABI Executive Director Amy Quackenboss said that persistent inflation, high interest rates, restricted credit, and global instability continue to compound the economic challenges facing struggling families and small businesses. But here is the detail that the reference footage flagged and that I want you to really sit with. Those February 2026 numbers, the 13% consumer increase, the 21% business increase, the 91% small business explosion, all of that was calculated before the Iran war's economic impact hit the data. The war started February 28th. The February bankruptcy data was largely filed before that, which means the March, April, and May numbers, when the full weight of $110 oil, $5 diesel, spiking grocery prices, and frozen credit markets hits households and businesses that were already on the edge, those numbers are going to be significantly worse. A Proskauer report found that 39% of private lenders say the U.S. is either in recession now or will be within 12 months, and more than a quarter say 2.5% or more of their portfolio is already in default. Wolters Kluwer published guidance for creditors this year with the headline, "Getting Ahead of Chapter 11. Filings in 2026, advising companies to prepare for elevated bankruptcy activity driven by geopolitical and economic pressures." And the local cascade effect is what most people miss entirely. When businesses that file Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 close their doors, the restaurants, dry cleaners, barbershops, and small retailers around them lose their customers. That triggers a secondary wave of small business failures. And then those employees lose their jobs and cannot pay their own bills, which triggers a tertiary wave of consumer bankruptcies. A researcher called this the job hugger effect. When people who were barely holding on to their jobs finally lose their grip and stop spending, the surrounding economy collapses with them. And we have not even begun to see the full impact of the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global energy market on a business sector that was already filing for bankruptcy at rates not seen since the Great Recession. 113,000 tech workers have already been fired this year, 825 per day, and the CEO who just cut half his company said every other company will do the same within 12 months. On February 28, 2026, the same day the Iran war started, Block, the company formerly known as Square, cut nearly half its workforce, half, close to 5,000 people. And the CEO, Jack Dorsey, did not apologize. He did not blame the economy. He did not blame the war. He said publicly that AI had made many of those roles unnecessary, and that within the next year the majority of companies will reach the same conclusion. That is not a prediction from a think tank. That is a sitting CEO of a major technology company telling you in plain language that what he just did to his employees is about to happen everywhere. And the data says he is right. American technology companies have eliminated more than 113,000 jobs so far in 2026, according to Tech Times, averaging 825 layoffs per day. Meta is processing 8,000 cuts this week alone, the first installment of what Reuters sources say could eventually reach 20% of the company. Amazon eliminated 14,000 corporate roles and explicitly cited AI as the reason, stating it enables leaner structures and faster innovation. Workday cut 8.5% of its workforce, roughly 1,750 people, to reallocate resources toward AI investments. And those are just the ones making headlines. Tech sector unemployment has climbed to 5.8% in early 2026, the highest level since the dot-com bust of 2001 to 2002, even as the overall unemployment rate sits at 3.8%. The median time for a laid-off tech worker to find a new job has stretched from 3.2 months in 2024 to 4.7 months in 2026. And a Stanford study published in late 2025 documented that the current wave is disproportionately affecting entry-level workers, which means the people who are just starting their careers, the ones who are supposed to be building the next generation of the American middle class, are the first ones being replaced. Goldman Sachs estimates that AI could displace 6 to 7% of the entire U.S. workforce if widely adopted. That is roughly 10 million jobs. And an academic paper published in March 2026 by researchers at Wharton warned that if AI displaces human workers faster than the economy can reabsorb them, it risks eroding the very consumer demand that firms depend on. They called it the AI layoff trap, an automation arms race where every company is incentivized to cut workers to stay competitive. But the collective result is that there are not enough employed consumers left to buy what the companies are selling. And here is the part that connects this to the collapse argument. A QA software manager with 30 years of experience said in one of the reference clips that for the first time in his entire career, he is nervous because he no longer has to code. He just tells the AI what to do, and it does it from start to finish. He does not have to analyze tickets, create test cases, or write a single line of code. He just prompts. And his advice to everyone watching was learn AI or get replaced. But here is what nobody wants to say about that advice. Learning AI does not save you, it delays you. Because once the tool is smart enough to replace the worker who does not know AI, it is only a matter of time before it replaces the worker who does. The QA manager who prompts the AI today is the QA manager whose prompting job gets automated tomorrow. And when Microsoft executives are telling their own employees in private meetings that most of them will be without jobs in 3 to 5 years, and office vacancy rates in San Francisco have hit 36.7%, because the companies that used to fill those buildings are now running leaner operations with fewer humans, you are not looking at a rough patch in the job market. You are looking at a structural transformation of the American economy that is happening faster than any institution, any politician, any safety net, or any retraining program can possibly keep up with. And the 113,000 people who have already been fired this year are just the beginning. 5 waves of price increases are heading toward your wallet right now, and most people will not see any of them coming until it is too late. Gasoline went up. You saw that. Everyone saw that. The number on the sign outside your local gas station jumped from under $3 to $3.88, and you felt it every time you filled up. But here is what your brain did with that information. Your brain filed it under annoying but survivable and moved on. And that filing is wrong, because gas is not the story. Gas is the opening act. There are 5 waves of price increases heading toward you right now, and they are arriving on different timelines, each one bigger than the last, and by the time most people recognize the full picture, 4 of them will have already hit. Wave 1 is gas. You already know this one. It showed up within days of the Strait of Hormuz closure. National average went from $2.92 to $3.88, according to AAA. California is above $5.30. Diesel, the fuel that powers every 18-wheeler that delivers everything you buy, spiked 36% to above $5 a gallon. The International Energy Agency called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not a moderate disruption. That is the largest in history. Wave 2 is landing right now. Groceries, specifically the perishables, produce, meat, dairy, the things that cannot sit in a warehouse waiting for prices to stabilize. Diesel powers the refrigerated trucks that bring those items to your store. CNN reported that it now costs 26% more to fuel a food delivery semi-truck than it did the day before the war started. going from $7.11 to $8.95 per fill-up. Retailers have been absorbing costs for months, first from tariffs and now from diesel. But a Boston College economics professor warned that if oil prices persist for any meaningful period, you will see a persistent cost shock that businesses simply cannot absorb anymore. And when they stop absorbing, your receipt catches up fast. Wave 3 is the one that should genuinely terrify you because it operates on a delay that makes it almost invisible until it is too late. Fertilizer. Fossil fuels account for up to 80% of fertilizer production costs. 1/3 of the global fertilizer supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. CNN reported this week that an Illinois farmer called his fertilizer supplier and could not even get a price quoted because the market is moving too fast to name a number. The food you eat in September and October is getting more expensive right now because of inputs that farmers are paying a premium for this month. Spring planting is happening as we speak. If yields drop because farmers plant without enough fertilizer, you are looking at a supply shock on grain, on meat, on dairy, on every processed food in the middle aisles of your grocery store. And you will not feel it until fall, long after the window for preparation is closed. Wave 4 is airfare. Jet fuel has surged roughly 85% since the war began. Airlines from Qantas to SAS to every major U.S. carrier have already announced fare hikes. And unlike gas, which fluctuates daily, airlines bake fuel costs into their pricing models months in advance. Those higher fares are not coming down quickly, even if oil drops tomorrow. If you are planning summer travel, the math just changed. Wave 5 is the one almost nobody has connected yet. Interest rates. The Federal Reserve was expected to start cutting rates this year. That expectation is dead. The OECD projects U.S. inflation at 4.2%, more than double the Fed's target. Some economists now project 0 cuts in 2026. Others are warning that if inflation accelerates further, rates could actually go up. If you were planning to buy a home, refinance, or pay down credit card debt that is sitting at 23% APR, the math just changed underneath you. And CBS News reported that if you were trying to buy a $600,000 home, it would cost you $168 per month more today than it did the day before the war started. That is not a rounding error. That is $2,000 a year in additional mortgage cost that materialized overnight because of a war you did not vote for. And here is the behavioral trap that makes all of this worse. Psychologists call it anchoring bias. Your brain grabbed the most visible data point, the gas price, and used it as a stand-in for the entire economic impact of this war. Because $3.88 feels annoying but survivable, your internal threat assessment filed the whole crisis under temporary inconvenience. Meanwhile, the fertilizer wave, the grocery wave, the airfare wave, and the interest rate wave are all building behind the one you can see. And by the time they arrive, the window for proactive adjustment will be closed. Your window is open right now, and it is closing. 30 million Americans are behind on their credit cards right now, and every single day they do not pay. They owe $368 million more in interest. $163 billion. That is the total amount of delinquent credit card debt sitting in collections across the United States right now, according to the Century Foundation and Protect Borrowers. Nearly 30 million cardholders, roughly 1 in 8 Americans who have a credit card, are currently behind on at least one account. And that number grew by 1.1 million people in a single year, from 28.6 million in Q1 2025 to 29.8 million in Q4 2025. That is 3,000 additional Americans falling behind on their credit cards every single day for an entire year. And it has not stopped. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York just released its Q1 2026 household debt and credit report 5 days ago, and the headline number is staggering. Total household debt hit $18.8 trillion. That is a new all-time record. Credit card balances alone stand at $1.25 trillion. And the delinquency picture is getting darker across every category. Auto loan delinquency just hit the highest level the New York Fed has ever recorded. Credit card delinquency is approaching levels last seen during the 2008 financial crisis. Student loan delinquency is at its worst since before the COVID-era payment pause, with 10.3% of balances now 90 or more days past due, and 2.6 million borrowers having their loans transferred to the Department of Education's Default Resolution Group. Protect Borrowers said the data shows that delinquent borrowers are increasingly behind on more than one type of loan at the same time, which is a sign that consumers are caught in what they called a perfect storm of financial strain. And here is the number that should make your blood boil. The average APR on credit cards in Q1 2026 is 21%. For new card offers, it is 23.75%. And every single day that Trump delays on his campaign promise to cap credit card interest rates, a promise he first made 546 days ago, according to Protect Borrowers, Americans accrue an additional $368 million in interest per day. That is $2.5 billion a week in interest charges that are compounding on top of balances that people already cannot pay. And credit card balances have increased 63% in just 5 years, from $770 billion in Q1 2021 to $1.25 trillion today. Among those carrying debt, 32% owe more than $10,000. A Newsweek investigation found that more than 1 in 8 cardholders have fallen behind, with communities of color disproportionately affected. And many are now turning to payday loans and buy now, pay later services to stay afloat, which are themselves debt traps with hidden costs and compounding fees. The Century Foundation published a report titled Interest Nation that laid out the full scope of what is happening, and it reads like a horror story. Credit cards have become a lifeline for millions of families who are using them not for luxuries but for groceries, gas, utilities, and rent. That is not consumer spending. That is survival borrowing. And when you borrow to survive at 21 to 24% interest, the math does not end with paying for what you bought. The math ends with owing twice what you borrowed and never getting out. A consumer debt expert named Steve Rode looked at the data and said something that cuts right to the point. He said people are not reducing credit card debt because they got religion about budgeting. They are reducing it because they are seeing the cliff ahead. That is survival instinct, not discipline. And the cliff he is talking about is the point where the interest exceeds your ability to pay anything on the principal, where every minimum payment goes entirely to interest and the balance never goes down. For millions of Americans, that cliff is not in the future. They are already standing on it. The government's most senior economic advisor just said the war in Iran is the last of their concerns. Meanwhile, your dollar buys less than it did last month. Kevin Hassett is the chairman of the National Economic Council. He is the most senior economic advisor in the White House. And when asked about the economic impact of the Iran war on American families, he said on camera that if the war were extended, it would not really disrupt the U.S. economy very much at all. He said it would hurt consumers, but that it is really the last of our concerns right now. I need you to sit with that for a second. The man whose job it is to advise the President of the United States on economic policy just told you on national television that the fact that you are paying $3.88 for gas, $5 for diesel, 26% more to fill a food delivery truck, and $168 more per month on a mortgage that you could barely afford before the war, all of that is the last of their concerns. And while he was saying that, here is what was actually happening to your money. CPI inflation jumped to 3.3% in March, the highest since May 2024, driven by a 19% year-over-year spike in gasoline and a 44% spike in heating oil. The OECD revised its U.S. inflation forecast to 4.2% for the year, 1.2 percentage points higher than pre-war projections. The Federal Reserve's own projections are similar. The Cato Institute projects that the PCE price index, which is the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, could hit 4% by year-end, which would be double the 2% target. And the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey, which is the most widely cited measure of how American households actually feel about their financial situation, showed that the Iran conflict erased every point of improvement in consumer confidence since February. All of it. 3 weeks of war undid months of slow recovery in how people feel about the economy. And here is the structural problem that makes this so dangerous. The Federal Reserve is trapped. They cannot cut interest rates to help the economy, because that would pour fuel on inflation that is already accelerating from the oil shock. And they cannot raise rates to fight inflation because that would crush an economy that is already buckling under energy costs and would push the housing market, the auto market, and the credit card market further into distress. CNBC reported that economists are now warning about stagflation, which is the worst-case scenario for your money because it means prices keep going up while the economy slows down and there is no clean policy exit. Fortune reported that Deutsche Bank and Oxford Economics ran simulations showing mild recessions in the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan if oil stays elevated, with the US edging toward what they called a temporary standstill. eParthenon's chief economist Gregory Dacko, who also serves as president of the National Association for Business Economics, said that the U.S. is experiencing a shock that will likely lead to higher inflation, and that if there is a severe prolonged shock, there is certainly a risk of entering a stagflationary environment. And CBS News reported the most devastating detail of all. When you strip away the defense spending and the AI data center investment, the actual consumer economy, the part that 70% of GDP depends on, is already contracting. Real spending across every income group has turned slightly negative. Whirlpool reported appliance sales down nearly 10%. The last time the Fed caved to political pressure during a supply shock like this was the 1970s, and the result was stagflation that lasted the better part of a decade. And right now the president is loudly demanding rate cuts. So when the most senior economic advisor in the country looks into a camera and tells you that the economic pain you are feeling is the last of their concerns, I need you to understand what that actually means. It means they know. They know what is coming. They know inflation is accelerating. They know the Fed is trapped. They know consumer spending is contracting. They know the bottom half of the K-shaped economy is already in a recession by every measure except the official one. And their response is to tell you it is the last of their concerns. That is not reassurance. That is abandonment. Every major oil shock in the last 50 years has been followed by a recession. Every single one. And this is the biggest oil shock in history. I want to walk you through something that nobody on financial television wants to say out loud, because it has implications that are too large and too frightening for a cable news segment. There is a pattern in the data that goes back half a century, and it has never once been wrong. Every major oil price shock in the last 50 years has been followed by some form of recession. Not most of them. Every single one. The 1973 OPEC embargo led to a 2-year economic contraction. The 1979 Iranian Revolution doubled oil prices and triggered another recession. The 1990 Gulf War oil spike preceded the early 1990s recession. The 2008 oil surge preceded the Great Financial Crisis. And the 2022 Russia-Ukraine spike contributed to the fastest inflation in 40 years and the most aggressive rate hiking cycle since Paul Volcker. The pattern is so reliable that some economists consider oil shocks one of the few dependable triggers for stagflationary conditions. And the current disruption is not just another oil shock. It is the biggest one ever recorded. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Oil production across Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE has collectively dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. That is not a sentence that gets used lightly, and it should fundamentally change how seriously you take what is happening. Brent crude surged from $70 to above $110 a barrel. At its peak, it briefly touched $120 before settling back. Gold spiked above $5,400 an ounce and then crashed 10% in a single week, its worst performance since 1983. The VIX, Wall Street's fear gauge, surged from the mid-teens to nearly 32. The S&P 500 dropped nearly 7% from its January peak. The Nasdaq briefly dipped into correction territory. The Russell 2000, which tracks smaller companies most sensitive to interest rates, officially crossed into correction last month, down more than 10% from its January high, and the Dow posted 4 consecutive losing weeks, its longest streak in 3 years. Meanwhile, the $1.8 trillion private credit market, which is the shadow banking system that lends to mid-market companies outside the regulated banking system, is showing cracks. Major funds have lowered their redemption gates, which is a polished way of saying your money is locked and you cannot get it back right now. When oil is above $100 and the companies these funds lend to are drowning in energy costs, investors panic and try to pull their money out. But the funds lent it on 5-year terms, and investors want it back in 5 minutes. That liquidity mismatch is exactly what caused the 2008 crisis in a different wrapper. And even when this eventually resolves, relief will not be instant. Economists describe what is called the rockets and feathers effect. Prices shoot up like a rocket when costs rise, but drift down like a feather when they fall. After Russia invaded Ukraine, gas spiked within days. It took months to come back down. After hurricanes destroyed Gulf Coast refining in 2005, same pattern. Spike was immediate. Recovery was glacial. The EIA now projects that gasoline will not fall below $3 a gallon at any point before the end of 2027. That is not a temporary disruption. That is a permanent repricing of the cost of living in America. And the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases 172 million barrels from the U.S. alone, the largest coordinated release in IEA history. Buy time. They do not fix the rupture. They are aspirin for a severed artery. So let me ask you the question that matters. If every oil shock in 50 years has been followed by a recession, and this is the biggest oil shock in history, on what basis are you assuming this time will be different? Because hope is not a strategy, and the pattern has never been wrong. For the first time in American history, more people are leaving this country than arriving. The American dream did not die. It was priced out of existence. For the first time in more than half a century, more people are leaving the United States than coming in. VisaVerge reported in April 2026 that net migration has turned negative, reversing a trend that defined this country for its entire modern history. America, the nation that was built by people who came here because they believed it was the best place in the world to build a life, is now hemorrhaging its own population. And the people who are leaving are not the ones you would expect. They are not retirees looking for cheaper beaches. They are skilled workers, young professionals, and families who have done the math and concluded that the American dream is no longer mathematically possible for them in America. They are moving to Portugal, to Spain, to Mexico, to places where their income stretches further because a studio apartment does not cost $2,000 a month, and a medical emergency does not bankrupt them. And the people who are staying are increasingly giving up on the milestones that used to define American adulthood. 77% of U.S. households cannot afford a median-priced new home. According to data from 2026, 1 in 3 Gen Z adults is still living with their parents. The median age of a first-time homebuyer has climbed to nearly 40, a full decade older than it was in the 1980s. Daycare costs have surged 39% since 2019, making the decision to have children a financial calculation that an increasing number of young people are deciding they cannot afford. 6 in 10 Americans under the age of 30 believe the American dream is out of reach, according to research cited by U.S. News and World Report. Not difficult to reach, out of reach, gone. And the Raj Chetty study from Harvard that has been cited in nearly every serious economic paper on mobility confirms the structural reality behind that feeling. More than 90% of children born in 1940 grew up to earn more than their parents. For children born in the 1980s, it is a coin flip, 50%. An MIT economist said mobility probably hit a record low in the early 2020s and there is no indication it is recovering. Newsweek ran a headline that said it plainly. The American dream is dead. And the article explained that your birth date now determines whether you will be part of a permanent class of debt-dependent renters or financially independent owners. That is not an economy. That is a caste system with a credit score. And here is the part that ties this to the collapse. A country that people are leaving is a country that is losing its tax base, its workforce, its innovation pipeline, and its future consumers. Brookings projects GDP growth will decline from 1.8 to 1.1% in 2026, partly due to reduced migration. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the sustainable pace of monthly job growth may turn negative by mid-2026. And when young people stop forming households, stop having children, and stop buying homes, the systems that depend on generational growth, Social Security, Medicare, the housing market, the education system, local tax revenue, all of them begin to contract. The American dream was the engine that powered this country for 250 years. It attracted the brightest minds, the hardest workers, and the most ambitious dreamers from every corner of the world. And in 2026, the year the United States turns 250, that engine is not sputtering. It is being dismantled by a housing market that has been financialized into an asset class, a healthcare system that bankrupts the people it is supposed to heal, an education system that saddles its students with a lifetime of debt, and a labor market that is being hollowed out by artificial intelligence while the minimum wage has not been raised in 17 years. The dream did not die of old age. It was priced out of existence. And the people who could have saved it are too busy protecting the asset values of the people who killed it. You are not watching a collapse. You are inside one. And the only question left is what you do before the next wave hits. All right, here we are. Number 1. And I am going to tell you something right now that is going to sound extreme, and I want you to measure it against everything I have just shown you over the last hour, and decide for yourself whether it is extreme or whether it is simply honest. You are living through the greatest collapse in American history. Not the fastest, not the most dramatic. The greatest in scope, in scale, and in the number of systems failing simultaneously. And the reason most people do not see it is because they are waiting for a collapse that looks like a movie. They are waiting for the stock market to crash to zero. They are waiting for the banks to close their doors. They are waiting for the lights to go out. And because none of that has happened, they tell themselves it is not that bad. But collapses do not work that way. The Soviet Union did not collapse in one afternoon. It deteriorated for years while the people living inside it kept going to work and standing in longer and longer lines and telling themselves the system would correct itself. And then one day it did not. And everyone who was not prepared lost everything. I am not comparing America to the Soviet Union. I am comparing the psychology of people inside a failing system to the psychology of people inside a failing system. It is the same in every era, in every country, in every collapse. People normalize the decline because the decline happens slowly enough to normalize. So let me line up what you just watched. The banking system is sitting on $306 billion in unrealized losses, while 1,788 banks have dangerous commercial real estate exposure, and the Fed is quietly injecting emergency liquidity. The economy has split in half, with GDP propped up by war spending and AI, while the actual consumer economy contracts. 150,000 bankruptcies filed in 90 days. Small business failures up 91%. 113,000 tech workers fired this year at 825 per day, with the CEO who cut half his company saying everyone else will follow within 12 months. 5 waves of price increases from the largest oil shock in history, with gas, groceries, fertilizer, airfare, and interest rates all moving against you at the same time. 30 million Americans behind on their credit cards, while $368 million in interest compounds every single day. The government's top economic advisor, calling your pain the last of their concerns, while inflation hits 3.3% and the Fed is trapped between cutting and raising. Every oil shock in 50 years followed by a recession, and this one is the biggest ever recorded. And for the first time in American history, more people are leaving this country than arriving because the American dream has been priced out of existence. Now tell me, if all of that happened in a single week, if every one of those numbers landed on the same Tuesday, what would you call it? You would call it a collapse. You would call it the worst economic crisis in American history. The only reason you are not calling it that right now is because it is spread across months and years, which gives your brain enough time to normalize each individual piece before the next one arrives. But the pieces do not care about your timeline. They are accumulating, they are compounding, and they are accelerating. So here is what I need you to do. First, stop waiting for permission to be alarmed. The data is the permission. You have it now. Second, go watch the video I made called 10 Things Every American Should Do Right Now Before Prices Get Worse. That video has the specific action steps, the emergency fund strategy, the debt attack plan, the pantry buffer, the subscription audit, the income diversification, all of it laid out step by step. This video showed you the fire. That video shows you the exit. Third, share this video, not for my channel, not for the algorithm. For the person in your life who still thinks everything is fine because the stock market is up and the GDP number is positive. They need to see what is underneath those numbers. They need to understand that the scoreboard they are watching is for an economy they are not in. And fourth, leave a comment and tell me which number on this list hit you the hardest. Tell me what you are feeling right now. Tell me what you are going to do about it. Because the people who come through periods like this are not the ones who had the most money. They are the ones who moved first. They are the ones who saw the signal, adjusted early, and made the small, unglamorous moves that created distance between themselves and the impact. And right now, today, your window to be one of those people is still open. But it will not be open forever. 5 waves are coming. 2 have already hit. 3 more are behind them. And the only question is whether you are going to stand in the path or step to the side. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your families.